What's up, guys? It's Colin from Next Man Up, and we just recently wrapped up the NBA trade deadline, which was highlighted by plenty of teams bringing in guys who they see as the missing piece for their championship run. But we also had some very interesting deals with the league's non-contenders. With that being said, we're going to fly through every deal made at or approaching the deadline, and how it can affect every team involved, negative or positive. Let's get into it. Some rapid fire deals I should mention but not dive fully into include Jaden Springer coming to the Celtics, Robin Lopez going over to the Kings, and Doug McDermott going to the Pacers. These were some low-key moves I felt like I should mention, but not going to give you guys a full breakdown on these. So let's kick it off. About a week before the deadline, we saw the floodgates open as the Rockets put together a deal to pick up Steven Adams for Victor Oladipo and 3 second-round picks. With Ime Udoka running the squad, the Rockets are starting to change their identity, and bringing in a tough backup big man like Steven Adams should be a huge addition. We won't see Steve out in Houston until next season once he heals up from his injury, but they were able to bring in a solid big for a really low price tag. For Memphis, it seems like Adams wasn't the player that they saw fitting their timeline as a championship level big, and they freed up some space by dumping him off. This move positions Memphis to have a big offseason with a high draft pick and some extra money to play around with. Shortly after that deal, we saw an unexpected move between the Pistons and the Jazz, which sent Simone Fontecchio over to Detroit for Kevin Knox and a second-round pick. Fontecchio has been quietly having a good year. The forward from Italy is shooting a high clip from 3 and hauling in a couple rebounds a night. We see in some later moves that we'll talk about that the Pistons are willing to move on from some of their better players, but they also still want a product to put out on the court. With little competition over in Detroit, I could see Fontecchio getting some really solid minutes and possibly cracking the starting rotation. For the Jazz, they have to move on from a guy that I'm sure they liked, but they bring in Kevin Knox, who has had some hot stretches in his own right, and Detroit's second round pick, which by all accounts will be the first pick of the second round next season, where surely they'll be able to draft a guy that they had a first round grade on, which can prove to be a pretty valuable asset this offseason. Next on the list is a deal between the Celtics and the Grizzlies. While some fans speculated a Marcus Smart return, both teams stayed much more low-key as Boston grabbed Xavier Tillman while they sent Lamar Stevens and 2 second round picks over to Memphis. As a Boston fan, I'll be the first one to tell you that the jury is still out over the feelings of the Celtics backup bigs. Kornet and Kieta both have looked solid at times. Kornet plays more often, but we all know Kieta has a little bit more talent. With that being said, even in a down year, we can acknowledge that Tillman is probably a better option. He's shooting a career low from the field, but I think a competitive Celtics team will be able to rally around a guy who plays defense and crashes the glass every night. For Memphis, you get value from an expiring contract who is admittedly underperforming, so you can't be too mad at the front office for getting a couple picks and Lamar Stevens, who can still play. The Pistons then made another move, sending out Monte Morris and bringing in Shake Milton, Troy Brown Jr., and another second-round pick in 2030. This move makes sense for both sides. The Timberwolves are one of the best teams in the league right now, but one of their biggest holes is playmaking off the bench. And as cool as Jordan McLaughlin is, Monte Morris is a much improved option and should be a positive impact the second he lands in Minnesota. For the Pistons, Monte wasn't really a player you leaned on very often. Your young talent is already in the backcourt, and Monte didn't really belong on a bottom feeder in the East anyways, so bringing in some new faces and a pick is probably as good as you were going to get. The Jazz and the Raptors were involved in the next trade. That's still keeping me a little bit confused. The Raptors bring in the Canadian Kelly Olynyk as well as Ochai Agbaji for Otto Porter Jr., Kyra Lewis, and a projected mid to late 2024 first round pick. For Utah, I get it. Ochai Agbaji is a player I like, but you've continued to bring in young guys like Bryce Sensabaugh, Taylor Hendricks, and Keontae George, who are going to dig into his minutes, so you can afford to give him up. And Kelly Olynyk is cool to have, I'm also a fan of his, but he's not going to be an essential piece of your team. And you bring in 2 new role players in their spots, as well as a 2024 first rounder. You can be happy about that value. For the Raptors, who are in rebuild mode, I just don't see why you'd move on from a pick that you have in the upcoming draft, even if it's not a premier selection. I don't really see why Kelly Olynyk and Ochai Agbaji move the needle for you to move on from value like that, so maybe there's something more to it. The 76ers made themselves a move with the Indiana Pacers and grabbed the elusive Buddy Hield for Marcus Morris, Furkan Korkmaz, and 3 second-round picks. On paper, this is a steal for Philadelphia. They grab another shooter for their backcourt and a guy that you can trust to play 30 or so minutes a night. Assuming Embiid can come back and keep Philly in contention, it'll be a lot easier to make plays when you have the attention-grabbing shooter like Hield on the outside. For Indiana, you have to remember where they're at with their roster. Hield is on the last year of his deal, and he's expensive. And in all honesty, the Pacers have already drafted a more interesting two-guard with Benedict Mathurin and have plenty of other players in the backcourt who can play in their own right. I think we also forget that Hield expressed his disagreements with the Pacers this preseason, so this seems like a move that had been cooking up for a little bit of time now. I don't think the Pacers had a lot of leverage in a Buddy Hield trade, so this might have been the best that they could get. Daniel House got traded to Detroit along with a second-round pick to avoid the luxury tax for Philadelphia, but we'll cruise past that one. We don't really know if House is even going to be on Detroit's roster. In a bigger deal, the Thunder decided to bring in veteran scorer Gordon Hayward, and the return cost is Tre Mann, Vasily Micic, Davis Bertans, and an undisclosed draft compensation. For the Thunder, you get Gordon Hayward's scoring ability and locker room presence on a very young squad who once again is exceeding expectations out in the West. Although he's making over $31 million this season, you don't have any other big contracts to tend to right now, and if he works out well, it's pretty obvious that he'll be costing a little bit less once his contract expires this summer, and I'm sure he'd come back to the squad on a smaller deal. For Charlotte, you're horrible, and you don't need to have Gordon Hayward putting up empty stats on your roster. You can afford to give run to Tre Mann and even maybe Micic as well, so it's worth it to get Hayward off your hands. Another pretty solid deal that we saw came right after, and it was a big man swap between Dallas and the Wizards, where the Mavs got Daniel Gafford and Washington received Richaun Holmes and some draft compensation as well. The Mavericks get a new big man off the bench to take some minutes away from Dwight Powell, which I'm sure fans will be happy about, and in one move, go from having a weaker frontcourt rotation to a pretty solid one. Gafford doesn't need the ball in his hands to play his best games, and he'll be happy to go to a contender. And for Washington, you get Richaun Holmes, who at this point is a project sort of big. We've seen him fly high and we've seen him not be very good. Any sort of draft compensation you get back as well will be necessary, but I think it's somewhat of a lopsided deal because when you look at this on paper, the obvious winner would be Dallas. But with the way the league works, you never really know, so we'll have to wait and see. It seems like every deadline now we see Dennis Schroeder get moved around the league every time, and this year was absolutely no different as the Raptors sent him along with Thad Young to Brooklyn in exchange for Spencer Dinwiddie, who was then waived. This trade is pretty well balanced on paper. While not being overly impactful, I would say Dinwiddie is the best player involved in this deal, and on a Raptors team that's trying to expand playmaking and build around Scotty Barnes, I trust a player like Spencer Dinwiddie to be at the helm more than I would trust Dennis Schroeder. Unfortunately, the Raptors waived him, so this may have been more of a salary dump than anything else, which is a bit of a head scratcher. For the Nets, you need more scoring across the board, and Dennis Schroeder and Thad Young can look to provide that, likely off the bench. And when you're underperforming, sometimes it's just nice to bring in some new names into the buildings. So for the Nets, it's a pretty low-risk transaction, and for the Raptors, I guess I'm kind of confused what the deal was. The Mavs and Hornets aren't done making deals yet as PJ Washington is sent to Dallas for Grant Williams, Seth Curry, and a 2027 first-round pick. As mentioned, the Mavs frontcourt was not great going into the deadline, and they brought in Grant Williams this offseason to be a floor-stretching four, which fits well with what they're trying to do over there. Unfortunately, he was not playing well in 2024. So instead of letting Grant rock into the postseason, they decided to trade him and pick up a much better player, in my opinion, who is PJ Washington. PJ will surely add some floor spacing alongside their other new addition Daniel Gafford as well. For the Hornets, you knew PJ's time was probably running thin, but you bring in Grant Williams who could turn things back to 2021 and be a pretty decent asset or maybe just a good player to play night to night. You also get a first-round pick that's going to be valuable, especially if you utilize it in a trade going forward, and there's nothing wrong with having Seth Curry on your team. I think both teams found their way to be a winner in this deal. The Bucks and 76ers swapped back up point guards as Pat Bev and Cam Payne switch locations, and the Sixers also get a second rounder out of it. This move makes sense for both teams in a way, but it's also very minor. But at the end of the day, the Bucks are all in on building this defensive identity, and at some point that comes with energy. Who else would you add except for Pat Bev for a very low price tag? For the 76ers, you'll take the second rounder and a guy in Cam Payne who is kind of more of that prototypical backup point guard, and I think will do good coming off the bench for a guy like Tyrese Maxey. They're going to run him in the rotation, at least I hope so, and I think it's a fair trade for both teams. One deal that was a little bit confusing and it wasn't reported by Woj right away was the Suns, Nets, and Grizzlies all hopping together and collaborating for a trade. The Suns get Royce O'Neal and David Roddy, the Nets get Jordan Goodwin, Keita Bates-Diop, and 3 second-round picks, and the Grizzlies get Yuta Watanabe, Chimezie Metu, and an undisclosed pick swap. I'm not going to lie to you guys, we probably don't know for sure which team won this trade, but each squad got to bring in valuable role players, with the Suns getting the best ones of the bunch, while the Nets and the Grizzlies got to bring in extra draft capital as well. This is not a move that will set the league on fire, but I'm sure we'll see the effects down the stretch for any one of these teams, and maybe one of these role players will pop off in a new location. And my favorite deal of the day was the Knicks and the Pistons collaborating to bring Bojan Bogdanovic and Alec Burks to the Big Apple in exchange for Evan Fournier, Malachi Flynn, Quentin Grimes, Ryan Arcidiacono, and 2 second-round picks. This is the last deal we're going to talk about in the video, and it might go down as the most important. The Knicks move on from some underperforming wings to bring in 2 role players who can prove to be very impactful for an unprecedented deep playoff run which the Knicks think they can make. While for the Pistons, they clear up some baggage in the backcourt. Bogdanovic is a good player, arguably on some nights a great player, so it's tough to move on from him, but Pistons fans probably knew it was time, and honestly, Alec Burks has been giving Detroit more headaches than big games lately, so I think they're okay with that as well. Grimes is a nice piece to get back, and maybe Flynn or Arcidiacono can find a place in the Pistons rotation. So not all is lost on their end either, but I think the Knicks are going to be the happier bunch from this trade. Well guys, that's going to do it. There is every move of the trade deadline that we just saw in the year 2024, and although we didn't see a superstar deal like 2023, we saw a lot of moves that could change the course to the end of this historic season. I hope you guys enjoyed, and leave a like if you feel so inclined. This was Colin from Next Man Up. We'll see you in the next one. Peace out.